Well, good morning. We're glad to see everyone here today. We really appreciate you being here, especially with the time change and all. We admire people for taking the time and the trouble to be in Bible class. This is Sunday, March 12th, Weber Road Church of Christ, Sunday morning Bible class. We do have some announcements, and we'll go ahead and read those before we have our prayer. Margie Brown is in the hospital. Ruby Rodriguez is having medical testing this week. Keisha Jocelyn and Jaslyn Price asking for prayers. Billy Britton is in the hospital still. Isaac Roy is recovering from knee surgery. Shelley Brady's mom is recovering from hip surgery. And our sympathy to Gordon Self and his family on the passing of his father. And then our sympathy to Brother Cecil Shaw in Jamaica on the passing of 3 of his siblings last week. So if you would, let us begin with a prayer. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you so much for our good health that we're able to be here this morning. We thank you for your love for us, that you sent your only begotten Son to die for us while we were still your enemies. We ask, Lord, that we would learn from your love and show love to all our fellow travelers on this earth. We ask, Lord, that you would bless our nation in this time of various issues, that our leaders would turn their thoughts toward righteous thoughts, and that would be what would govern their ways. We ask, Lord, that you would bless those that serve this nation in foreign fields, and those that they would be safe and you be able to return to their families at the appointed time. We ask that you would bless those that are first responders here in the U.S. and that they would be protected. And we ask, Lord, that you would bless us, that we forgive us our sins as we often fail you and fail to meet up to the standards you've set and our obligations. We ask that you would forgive us for those things and help us and strengthen us, that we can be encouraged and we can encourage each other and be with us in this study. And we ask that all things be done in accordance with your word, in Christ's name. Amen. I thought I'd do something just a little bit unconventional today and do a lesson where a lot of times we look at lessons from the Bible and then we try to deduce how we could use it apply to our lives. And so this was a little different. We're going to look at an application of some things that happened in a historical event and see how they use certain lessons that we should, induce, that we could use in our lives, and look at a Bible reference that sort of supports that concept. So it's a little different, but this is about the notional what we can learn from a historical event that occurred at the beginning of World War II, the Battle of Wake Island. And what was that all about? Well, Wake Island was like one of the farthermost western islands that America had a base on in the kind of the Central Pacific. And when Japanese struck Pearl Harbor on December 7th, they also struck, parallel to that, several other American forward bases. A lot of people don't know that, but they had a coordinated attack on the Philippines, and then sort of based on the international date line and what day it actually was. They also struck Wake Island, because that was one of America's farthest bases. It actually also was kind of an atoll, a split island, and they had a Pan Am airport there. Pan Am flights would go into the Far East, would land there and then refuel, and they had a hotel there, I think, and they had a bunch of people at that time. There were workers, construction workers were there, and they were building some more things to support that base. But America knew they were going to get into war. You could feel it coming, and so that America was strengthening those forward bases. And they had just sent a new naval commander out there, Cunningham, to start to get tuned up for what might ever happen. And that was only just, I think, a few weeks before a brief time before the actual attack. But there was another guy there, Major Devereaux in the Marines, and there was a detachment of American fighter planes there. I think there were 12, and there was a forward air group, and they were using the Wildcats, which was like the best plane America had at the time, I think. What's going on? Am I losing my mind here? We had a power blip, looks like. Anyway, I'll just keep talking. So they were get that going. Anyway, they were preparing for war. They knew eventually there would be some attacks, and so the guys were getting tuned up out there, but they kept on building these things for the civilian population with all this construction, the guys that were there. So when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, they also bombed this island a little bit later, and like the next day or something, they had a bombing run. The Japanese bombers came and hit a bunch of things on the island, so the guys knew that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. They were in the war, so they started actions to try to figure out what they were going to do, figuring they would be attacked and maybe overrun. And they'd already had this raid of bombers, and they destroyed some of the things they had there. Their armament on that island was kind of interesting. If you study it, in World War II was coming. Everybody knew there was going to be a big war. America in the 30s was refurbishing a lot of its equipment, and they refurbished the battleship Texas. So if any of you have ever been to the battleship Texas monument up there outside of Houston, that is a national mechanical engineering landmark, because it's one of the last ships that was built. The battleship Texas is a World War I era battleship. It has World War I era equipment on it, but they revamped the boilers on it and it has reciprocating steam engines. It's one of the last ships with recip steam engines. Later, they would put diesel engines and turbines and steam turbines and things on these ships. But it's a landmark because it's one of the last ones with actual recip steam engine, but it's converted to run on diesel fuel rather than coal, and that's the way they tried to get all the ships geared up. So when they were revamping the battleship Texas, they took a lot of the guns off and they revamped the guns too, and so they have these big, I think there were 6 5-inch guns on Wake Island that had been demoed out of the battleship Texas, believe it or not. And so that was their long-range guns they had on that island. Well, let me back up and tell you a story. It's when I grew up, where I grew up, in North Louisiana, and we every once in a while would go to Shreveport. Well, there was a certain road we'd take inside of Shreveport to go to the shopping or wherever my parents were going, and we drove by this National Guard barracks there, and there was this old cannon out there in front of this National Guard barracks, and it was a wooden thing, and you looked at it, and if you drove by and looked, and said, that cannon barrel is made out of a post. It's not a steel cannon. It's a black wooden post, but it's mounted in a cannon wheels and a frame, and it looks just like a cannon. But you get closer, look at that. And I remember my parents telling me that's from Fort Humbug. And I said, and we'd ask, what's Fort Humbug? And he said, well, when Shreveport in the Civil War, the Union forces came up Mississippi River and said they came up Red River and got a look at Shreveport. Well, the guys in Shreveport didn't want to have the Union forces attack Shreveport, so they had gotten together and built dozens of these fake cannons. And they'd get the wagon wheels and they'd build the frame, and they only had a few cannons, but they strung out the old clay hills there. It's kind of like there's a lot of red clay up there, and that's why they call it the Red River. And so they went up and down both sides of that river near Shreveport with all these fake gun emplacements. And they'd have a few real ones interspersed among them, and they would fire them off every once in a while. But the rest of them, tons of them were fake. And so when the spies came up the river to see if they wanted to attack Shreveport, they looked in there, and there's all these gun emplacements everywhere. They decided, we're not going to attack Shreveport. So they called it Fort Humbug, and it was a big deception. In the military, you look into the military, and they do a lot of that. It's psyching out the enemy and trying to figure out. So after these back to Wake Island, after these bombers had hit a lot of the defense emplacements on the island, well, Commander Devereaux, or Major Devereaux in the Marine Corps, and these guys got together and said, let's take our 5-inch guns, as I understood it, and some of the other guns, and let's hide them, and let's use these construction forces that are on this island to help us build some fake guns and stick them out there in those emplacements, because we knew those Japanese bombers had seen where the guns were, and they're going to come back on a subsequent raid, and they're going to hit those long-range guns. So they did. They put fake guns out there. But somebody accidentally or intentionally left some ammunition out there with them. So when the Japanese came and the subsequent raids and they hit those gun emplacements, there was huge explosions of a lot of the powder and charges they had. So they figured they had gotten those big guns. They just annihilated them. So later, now the Japanese are coming with a destroyer and some escorts and different forces, smaller, most of this is a very small island, and they're going to attack Wake Island. Well, they come in, and Major Devereaux says, don't fire till they're really close, because we may have deceived them, and they think we don't have any long-range guns. So sure enough, they got in within 4,000 yards, and he let those Marine gunners have at them, and they sunk, I think, one Japanese ship immediately. And then the airplanes got up, and I think Hank Elrod dropped a bomb down one of them's stack and blew another one up, and it totally, and then they were hitting them with their long-range guns, and the Japanese didn't know they had. So it turned back the invasion. The first Battle of Wake Island was a total victory for the U.S. only a few days after Pearl Harbor, because they used their cunning and deception to try to do what they could to fight the enemy. There was a resupply ship, a set of ships come in to resupply that island, and they turned back. The Americans decided it was too risky to get out there after Pearl Harbor, and they'd lost so many ships, and they were going to resupply that island, and then they turned back. So later, the island was attacked again. the Japanese came back with huge carriers, not the small escort type carriers, and there was another bunch of defense guys were on the other side, and as the battle raged on in that second battle, the part of the island where the officers, most of the high-ranking officers were the other, where the officers weren't there much, they destroyed all the Japanese that were coming at them. Destroyed every landing craft and every troop. But on the other side, they weren't having quite as much luck, so they wound up surrendering the island. And then the Japanese took the officers, Commander Cunningham and Major Devereaux, took them prisoner, and they lived through the rest of the war as prisoners. And they were released later at the end of the war. But the Japanese were really upset, and they killed a bunch of Americans. Later, they kept them in kind of a prison on that island, and later they massacred a bunch of people. But why do I tell that story? I said, I think when we look at it, are we able to get this back? Yeah. Okay. They didn't have a lot of resources. They used what they could. The Bible talks to us about that a lot. And this quote from Exodus is when God is talking to Moses and trying to get him to do his duty and go help. And God asked him, "What's that in your hand?" And well, it's a staff. Well, he says, "Let me show you what I can do." And he throw that staff down, and he turns it into a snake. And he now reach and pick that snake up, and it turns back into a stick. God shows Moses, "I'm in charge. I can help you. I'm here to help you." Actually telling Moses. So even Moses had to be encouraged to, you can use what you have, and I will give you power over your adversaries. It's not just you doing this, Moses. And then I like to think the inferior resources, they had secondhand guns on that island. They had been surplused off another ship, and they had the anti-aircraft guns they didn't have directors that worked, 1 out of 4 worked or something. It was just, when you have small resources, a few resources, you can use what God gives you, and you can do something. And think of David and Goliath. He had a sling. He didn't have any, and he goes up, and the Israelites aren't fighting Goliath. They don't even have a clue what to do when Goliath challenges them and curses the God of heaven and insults Israel. And David, who'd been anointed and had a indwelling of the Holy Spirit by then, he's just incensed at this. And so he does what he can, and he looks at Saul's weapons, and he says, "I'm not going to use these weapons." And all he knew was what he had was a sling. And he went, and God enabled him to do that, what he did. So don't look at the resources and say, "Well, I don't have the best resources," or "don't have this," or "don't have that." God teaches us to use what we have and be resourceful and use that skill and cunning. And remember, David had a staff, and when he ran out to Goliath, we think, may be a pituitary defect giant. He may have eye problems, and he may have seen more than one David. We don't really know, but some of the things he said indicate that. And David's holding that staff, and Goliath doesn't see the sling until David is really close, and he pops that sling out and uses it. So use what God gives you, and use skill and cunning, and don't be afraid to serve God with what you have. And then the other thing about limited resources and difficult circumstances, they kind of force us to focus on the real objective. You don't have time for fluff and secondary issues when you're in distress and strained, and you don't have much. And kind of like between Martha and Mary, when Martha's serving all this food and Jesus is there teaching. Well, Mary says, I'm going to listen to Jesus. And so, we'll bake one batch of bread and everybody can eat bread. Well, no, Martha wants to cook all this wonderful food and do all this stuff, and she gets upset at her sister. And Jesus says, no, look at the most important thing. Focus on what's important. That helps you when you're short-handed. Let's prioritize what we're doing. If our goal is to preach the gospel and teach people, let's think about what it takes to do that rather than worry about a lot of ancillary, secondary issues. Now here's one I like about innovation. Innovation is possible, it's useful, and it can be decisive, even in what I call the simplest form of innovation. Don't be afraid to innovate. And let's call to mind some innovations you remember from the scriptures. Just sort of odd things people did. And I love this one in Mark, too, when Jesus is teaching early in his ministry, and they're in a house, somebody's house, and he's preaching and teaching in there, and these four guys are bringing their friend, a lame man, a paralyzed man, and they can't even get to see Jesus because you just can't get through the crowd at the house. So these guys go up on the roof, and they break the roof open. And they lower this guy in through somebody's roof. They just broke open. And we know, roofs were made out of different kind of thatch and things back then, and so maybe it wasn't that big a deal, but it's a pretty big deal if somebody break your roof open to lower somebody in there to see Jesus. And that, of course, Jesus is impressed. And he's impressed with what he calls their faith. They believed in him so much that they would lower this man, and I think he forgives that man's sins, and he gets in trouble with the Pharisees. You can't forgive sins. Well, which is easier, to say rise up and walk or forgive his sins? And he does both. So I love that story because it sort of says be resourceful and innovate a little bit. And then Luke 19, you know what that story's about. Who's that? That's Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is short. He's very rich. He's wealthy. He's like a head tax collector. He's made a lot of money. Sometimes maybe not so good ways of doing it, but he made a lot of money. He's hated by other Jewish people. But he wants to see Jesus. He's intrigued by these stories of the healings and the miracles and the teaching and the profound words that come from Jesus. So he wants to see Jesus. So what does he do? He's a short guy. He can't even see over the crowd. So what does he do? He climbs a tree. Now, if you know anything about Jewish culture, hanging around on trees was anathema. That was like, nobody does that. In fact, it's thought to be a punishment to hang someone on a tree. It's very, it's not something people want to be known for. So he breaks all the rules of cultural norms at the time. He climbs a tree so he can see, because he knows Jesus is coming this way. And Jesus knows all that, and he sees him, he speaks to him, and then he goes to his home. So a little innovation helps sometimes, and sometimes it's the deciding. If he had not climbed that tree, Jesus, he would not have seen his faith. But by climbing that tree, he saw Zacchaeus, and he saw his faith, and he saw his interest. And it was a little bit of innovation can go a long way, and if we handled it right. And let's see. Courage is essential to success. When in Judges, you can look at a lot of different accounts from the Old Testament, but when they're starting to winnow out the people, or getting ready to battle the invaders, one of the first things they ask is. Let me see if I can read it. It's sort of interesting the way they put it. Judges 7, you'll like this. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver you, Midian, into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. Announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. Okay, the first screening, God gives Gideon to do is, let's call all of them out there that are afraid. So courage is one of the things we want to look at is when you get ready to serve God and you're doing something you haven't done, you're stepping out of your comfort zone, you're doing something, speaking to someone you haven't spoke to about this, remember, don't be afraid. Take courage that God is with you. And don't despair or panic, but have hope. And Galatians 6:9 says that we'll reap if we faint not. If we keep working when we're very tired, we don't feel like it, and there's no results, you keep working anyway. You keep at it. You work in faith. You step out in faith and you do something in God's service. Don't be afraid to step out when everybody says, give up. That's when you step out and you do things for God that you didn't think you could do. Have hope. Success may be close at hand, closer than you can imagine. In other words, if you're struggling to serve God or you're in a pitched battle or wherever you are, one of the things they tell military people is don't worry so much. The other guys are worn out too. Your enemy's tired too. And so you may be closer to victory than you know. And that kind of happened on Wake Island. They really had destroyed the second invasion, and they gave up. Possibly would have had a different outcome if they had been able to communicate better. And anyway, so don't give up thinking you're at the cusp of failure. You may be at the cusp of victory. This may be turning around. When you're using the gospel in a new way, you're preaching through the internet, or people are watching our service. Victory. Don't be so discouraged and pessimistic. Here's one of my favorites: don't choose defeat. Force the issue until the end, and make defeat come and get you. And this is an interesting story most people don't know about. I'm going to go ahead and read it in 2 Samuel. It's kind of a fascinating time. 2 Samuel, David has been king of Israel. He's been king of Israel for a few decades now. He's aged sin with Bathsheba, and it's very sad, but he's serving God the best he can, and they're still having wars with the Philistines, but David's very old. He's very tired. But he's been one of their major sources of strength to their army because he's such a valiant fighter himself, and they followed his example. Remember how he killed Goliath, and that started the whole thing, and in the event of Goliath, there was a whole army there, and there were probably detachments of slingmen, and nobody stepped up to fight Goliath. I mean, they were listening to Goliath on his terms. Come out here and do this. They were frozen in fear, and David taught them by deed how to overcome that fear and go do something. And so by the end of several years under David's leadership, that army has been transformed. It's a wild and woolly bunch. Let me tell you, and you can tell I'll read this 2 Samuel passage. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David, this is 2 Samuel 21:15 through 22. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, rumored that these were relatives of Goliath, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, "Never again will you go out with us to battle." So that the lamp of the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha, another giant. There's another guy killing a giant. So it isn't just David that can kill a giant. By the end of a decade or two with the army, he's taught all these guys to be innovative. And he said, in another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jari-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath. This is also is a name Goliath, the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. In still another battle, which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. Other killed him. These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. So what am I saying? Well, if you do the right thing and you teach what's supposed to be taught and you keep working at it through the years, you will train people and you will have new recruits coming along, and they'll be trained and they'll have that Spirit of God in them, and they'll have that strength and they'll have that tenacity, and you don't have to do it all. They pick up the load. So as you think there. Desperation induces either action or despair. If you're desperate times, you can react either with desperation and in despair. And in Acts 16:22-30 is discussion, Paul and Silas in prison and Philippi, and they've been beaten and they've been beat down, and they're in this nasty prison. And what do? In the middle of the night, what do? They're praying and they're singing hymns. They couldn't do much else, but they're doing what they could do. And then what happens? There's an earthquake. They get the Philippian jailer is going to kill himself, and they say, "Don't kill yourself. We're all still here." And they convert the Philippian jailer, and all the other guys get out of prison too. And he washes their wounds. And he doesn't lose his life with the Romans because they go to his house, and he can say, "I still have custody of these people." So God turns the situation completely over. He encourages his people. He's there for them. He's with them. I was so impressed. He said, "Well, wait a minute. I want some of this. This is like a life force I've never known." So there we are. There's your lesson. And thank you for listening.